One of the questions that I love to ask leaders sounds so simple that most people usually answer it without thinking about it too hard. I ask them how decisions get made in their company. I don't talk about just the big decisions. I definitely want to know about that. I don't want to just talk about the ones that everyone remembers months later. I want to hear about the ordinary ones that show up throughout the week. The moments when someone runs into a problem or an opportunity appears or something unexpected just throws the plan sideways and somebody has to decide, what do we do next? When a leader walks me through how those decisions move through the company, I learn a surprising amount of information very quickly. Sometimes the answer comes out in a pretty calm, matter of fact way. The leader can describe who typically handles what, where people have room to act on their own, and when something truly needs to come back directly to them. There's a kind of a ease in the explanation, the same way that you can usually tell when someone's comfortable driving a car because they're not gripping the steering wheel like it's trying to escape from them. Other conversations take a slightly different turn. Instead of describing how decisions move through the company, the leader starts explaining what's been happening to the business lately. Maybe they say the market shifted at some point, or hiring just became so complicated way more than it used to be. Maybe they talk about a competitor who appeared and started doing something that forced everyone in the space to adjust. None of these things are unusual. In fact, if you run a company long enough, you will eventually discover that the outside world has a very, very impressive talent for rearranging all your plans. But as the leader keeps talking, something interesting begins to show up in the story. You realize that they're not really describing leadership inside the company. They're describing a series of events that have pushed the company in a completely different direction. Once you hear it, you start noticing the same pattern in more places than you ever really expected. It shows up in companies that are growing and profitable. Most people look at them and assume they're doing just fine. Yet the person running the business often feels a strange kind of weight that they never anticipated when they started building the whole thing in the first place. They do not always say it this way, but if the conversation goes on long enough, the thought eventually appears somewhere in the room. Why does so much of all of this still seem to come back to me? After you sit in enough of these conversations, and I've sat in a lot of them, you begin to recognize a moment that shows up with eerily predictable timing. The leader's going to spend a few minutes describing the business, the projects, the people, the usual updates that fill in most leadership conversations. And somewhere along the way, the focus drifts away from the company and lands squarely on their calendar. They start walking you through the week, not in an overly dramatic way, just kind of matter of fact. A message that came through late in the evening because someone needed a decision before the morning meeting. Or maybe it's a meeting that wandered well past its scheduled end because the room was circling a question that nobody really felt entirely comfortable answering. Maybe it was a small issue that somehow made its way back across the leader's desk, even though everyone involved was perfectly capable of solving it. Do any of those sound familiar? Now, none of those moments are unusual on their own. Anyone responsible for a business expects a certain amount of interruption and course correction. It's part of the job, whether anyone writes it down as a job description or not. What becomes interesting is when those moments start filling most of the week, when the leader starts blocking out time to deal with that stuff. You can usually see the realization forming in the leader as they talk it out. The business itself might be doing well. Customers might be showing up repeatedly. The team is, well, not incompetent, and yet the day-to-day experience of running the company has become strangely dense. Decisions pause longer than they used to. Conversations stretch out while people wait to see which direction actually feels safest. When something lands in the gray area, the easiest move is to just send it back to the person who started the company and let them sort it all out because, hey, they got all the answers, right? Problem is, no one in the organization ever sat down and agreed that that was how things should work. The pattern just formed quietly while the company is growing and everyone's moving fast enough that the structure underneath the leadership never gets examined very closely. Over time, the leader becomes something that they never really intended to be. They become the place where uncertainty goes. And once that dynamic settles into the culture of the company, you begin hearing questions that many leaders eventually ask out loud, usually with a mixture of curiosity and fatigue. It sounds something like this: how did everything end up right back here? I want to end this video with something that happened at our house recently because it stayed with me longer than I expected, and I think it illustrates this point. My grandson Joseph is 3.5 years old. I talk about him a lot. He's been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, level 2. And one of the things that he's currently fascinated with is the heating vents in our house. He comes in and he counts them, he looks inside them, and if something falls into one, it becomes a really serious situation really quickly. The other day, a small piece of a metronome, of all things, fell down one of the vents. At his house, his dad can usually get things out pretty easily, but the vents at our house are much deeper. So once something drops down there, it's usually gone. Joseph looked down the vent and he said one of the phrases that he uses when something doesn't go the way he expected. Uh-oh. Then he asked me to get it out. Now, whenever I talk to Joseph, I kneel down so we're at the same level because that helps me. So I got down next to him and we both looked into the vent with a flashlight. I couldn't see the piece. It was gone. Now, my first instinct was the same instinct that most of us has when someone we care about asks for help. I wanted to fix it. I wanted to be the person who reached down there and somehow made the problem disappear so that everything in Joseph's world would be okay again. But that wasn't the reality of the situation. That piece of the metronome, it wasn't coming back out. So instead of pretending we could get it, we stayed there for a few minutes, looking down the vent together while I tried to explain what was going on as best as I could. Now, explaining anything to a 3.5-year-old with significant speech delays is not exactly a smooth conversation. So it wasn't some beautiful teaching moment. It was just two dudes laying on the floor, looking into a vent with a flashlight, trying to figure out how to deal with something that wasn't going to change. Now, a little later in the day, Joseph's dad came to pick him up. Joseph walked right up to him and asked him to get the piece out. His dad opened the vent cover and looked down inside. Joseph learned that it was gone. And after a moment, he understood that it was gone. He had now heard it from both me and his dad. Now, there wasn't a big reaction. Nothing dramatic happened. He just accepted it in the quiet way that Joseph often accepts things once he sees them clearly. That moment stayed with me, not because of anything that I did. If anything, it said more about Joseph than it ever could about me. He adjusted. He faced something that didn't go the way he wanted, and he kept moving forward. Now, for me, someone who's been told my whole life that autistic kids just can't do things well, it felt like a pretty big thing for me to watch. Moments like that remind me of something that I see in companies all the time. Not every problem can be removed for the people around you. Some things just happen. When that happens, the work isn't pretending that the situation is different. The work is staying in the moment with people long enough for them to see it clearly too. Sometimes that looks like a neat leader kneeling down next to someone and shining a light into a situation so everyone can see what's really there. Sometimes the answer is much more simple. Sometimes the answer is just that the piece fell down the vent and it's not coming back.